First question I ask all my guests. It's such a buzzword. Everyone always says it. But Judge Pratt, what does it mean to you? What does the word authenticity mean to you?
So thank you so much for having me on the show. And before I even answer your question, I need to say this. I am the daughter of an African-American garbage man who was born in New York, in Harlem, but spent his summers in the segregated South. My father never felt like he had the full rights of citizenship, not even after they signed the Civil Rights Act. Soy la hija de una peluquera dominicana que vino para este país para una vida mejor, para sus hijos que aún no habían nacido. Now, I do that because it is how I present everywhere I go. And it is important that people understand that that is who the person is in front of them. Now, this is someone who's speaking to you now who has accomplished a lot in her career. But it wasn't until that thing happened, until I really went in, that I was able to get those things done. So when you talk to me about authenticity, for me, authenticity is standing in this space where I bring my full self, my ideas, my experiences, my upbringing of being a first generation, the child of a first generation immigrant, and those values, and the Black is beautiful and the civil rights movement, showing up in that space and knowing that that is who I am, that I drink deeply from a well that I did not dig, so that I have committed myself to service, but that I serve because I have something to add. And so authenticity for me is showing up. I smile because I'm like, maybe I should have worn my hair out because I have my twist and I have my hair pulled back. But I'm like, this is an appropriate ponytail, right? And what it means for an Afro-Latina who just the other day was in an Uber and the guy is Dominican and he's as Black as me. And he's like, oh, tú no tienes nada que dice que tú hablas español, right? Because that's a cultural issue. And I'm smiling because I'm like, well, what am I supposed to have? A tattoo that says that I speak Spanish? Being able to understand what those things are. So authenticity is really showing up and bringing all your talents and gifts, all of them. And I have been known for being in rooms and seeing, particularly women, and Latino women, we do this as well. There'll be a room, we'll work on a project, and everybody sits at the table. And so sometimes the women sit on the back. And I go and I nudge the woman. I'm like, you walk into a room, you sit at the table until somebody asks you to get up. Because the likelihood that somebody's going to ask you to get up is very slim. But you know as much about this project as the person who's yapping, who's talking about it right now. But that this, and then not just sitting at the table. I want you sitting at the table and going, hold on. Ms. Dolores has been living in this community for 20 years, holding down the taxes for the whole community. And so when you start, so how is this policy going to impact her? So it's not just showing up and say, see me, it's showing up and let me tell you why I know about these things. So I began my career as a teacher. I taught English as a second language at La Casa de Don Pedro. So during the day, I taught. Yes.
Wait, let's not get into career yet. Wait.
I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. But no, I guess I say that because so much of that is what I bring. I bring all of those experiences. And so being authentic is that. It's the fact that I make faces. Woo-hoo, when people say things that don't make sense or crazy. Woo-hoo, when I'm doing Q&A and somebody says something, I'm like, woo-hoo, I don't think you should be doing that, right? And people laugh, but I'm like, that is my response to foolishness. And that is okay. And that is absolutely okay. That I say that there are words that I say, I might mention to folks I ain't never scared when I'm talking about something that I've been confronted with in my career. But that is the most powerful way for me to express that emotion.
Yeah.
And showing up authentically, what I have learned allows people to come in and be authentic as well.
It's interesting that even you, in preparation for this, right, you're going to be on Zoom, it was like a visual thing. you were even contemplating different hairstyles. You were like, I need to keep this. Did you say the word neat? I think
No. I didn't say.
pulled
I
back.
said
You
I
said,
no. I said I was pulling it back, but in fact, I probably should have let it go in its natural, just all over the
mm,
place state. It's just that I was like, it still might be wet, so I just happened to
oh,
pull my 2-strand twist back, and I was like, oh, maybe if it had been dry, I would have just shown up as I show up in the world with my big hair and
mm.
my big voice and my features and my big ideas.
Yeah, it's interesting too, this idea of like your full self though. Like,
Mhm.
I wonder, like, was it easy for you growing up to be your full self? Like, what sort of expectations do you think your family had on you? Because I think all of our family have not only
Yes.
certain expectations, but they try to push us in a certain direction of like how they want us to be.
Absolutely not. I grew up in a family where I was Afro Latina,
Mhm,
and but there were people that were we have all shades. My cousins are lighter, straighter hair, and what
mhm,
that meant for una negrita in the family,
mhm,
what the expectations were, which weren't high, because we have equated value and intelligence to skin complexion and hair. And then my father, came up in this Black is beautiful and the civil rights movement. And so did these conflicting messages for me, right? And I'll tell you, I don't remember how old I was, but I saw Oprah. Oprah had just come on television, and I was watching a show, and she did a show on beauty, because so much for women is connected to how people view you. And she did a show on beauty, and the person, and she made an offhand comment, and the comment was, I knew I'd never be beautiful, so I decided that I would study hard and be smart. And it was as if the world had stopped, because sometimes, when you're getting a message, and it was as if she spoke to me. It had never occurred to me that you didn't have to be born smart, but that you could study hard and be smart. And I went from being a CD student in school. I went back to school, moved my chair, made the teachers teach me by sitting in the front, and became an honor roll student for the rest of my career. Now, the reason that's important is because I didn't have a lot of people around me. My mother really did require excellence, but it was hard coming up in this space trying to look like this thing and not seeing, little colored girls on music videos reinforcing that you were beautiful, because, it had to be that. And
mhm,
so when I graduated from college and I got into law school, I didn't get in immediately. Imagine that, they didn't let me into law school. I went back every day to talk to that dean, like, you must not have seen my application well. But I remember going to one of my aunts to tell her, and she began to bawl. And the reason she was bawling wasn't just because she was happy, was because she said, and that is going to be una negrita in the family that brings the license here. In her wildest dreams as a Afro Latina, she couldn't imagine that that could happen. And so going into these spaces, um, knowing that being smart was more important than these other things, gave me some kind of freedom. But I still was very self-conscious about, how do I show up in this space where culturally I'm different, and racially, also. I remember being a young attorney, and I was raised, you call older people Miss and Mr. And I'm looking at colleagues, and I'm like, I can't call my adversary Mr. Dennis. I can't do that. And having to learn these spaces. Also, going into these spaces, and the people that I always spoke to were the service people, the people in the kitchen, the people who were related to me, right? And often having colleagues who were like, why is she so friendly with the cleaning lady? Or why did and those were cultural things for me,
mhm.
because I was taught that, you treat everybody you meet with dignity and respect, which for me was the most important lesson that I carried.
This idea of representation at an early age, right? Like,
Mhm.
not seeing a lot of people that look like you on TV, but then seeing that person like, oh wow, Oprah, or even like Oprah talking about something like beauty, and then you hearing this idea of academics being really important. All of that though, okay, I need to study, I need to go into academics. But at least for me, like I knew I knew I had to go to college. I knew I had to do certain things in order to be quote unquote successful or advance in society, but I didn't really know what to study though. Like, why did you land on law or even wanting to go to law school?
Oh, because at a very early age, I wanted to change the world, and I could not be dissuaded that there was no way I could do it. And I remember being, I wanted to teach English as not English as a second language. I wanted to be a tutor, literacy volunteers. I lived in books. My mother, English was her second language, but she would take us to the library on Mondays. I remember Monday was the library day, and we would devour books. So this idea that people couldn't read and what kind of a disadvantage that put them at. So I wanted to become a literacy volunteer. So I went to in Newark, there was this agency and you had to do a training, and the training happened to be at Rutgers Law School. And as I walked through the halls, you could see the pictures of the graduates from the 50s and 60s. And then there was a change when the minority student program came into existence. And the minority student program at Rutgers came into existence because during the rebellions, people went to Rutgers and were like, we want people who look like us in this building. And so that was the Puerto Rican and Black coalition shifting politics and shifting things. And so again, when I say I drink deeply from a well that I did not dig, those folks weren't trying to go to law school, but they were creating a space for people like us to be able to have it as an opportunity. So
almost reminded you of your dad a little bit, probably.
Oh, absolutely. And so how do you pay this forward? So this idea that you had a right to be even in this space, and then you get into the space and you still have to fight in this space. So for me, what's been great about those, what is that, the Varsity Blues case, is that people of color, we've always known that folks have gotten in because of legacy and all kinds of other foolishness. And then they want to talk about us in these institutions when you've had every opportunity and every advantage, and somebody still has to pay for you to get into this institution. And so belonging and having a right to be in these spaces for me was still something I had to be challenged. I was challenged with. So showing up and looking youthful, and what that meant for me, but knowing that if I studied hard, if I did, and my absolute commitment to being of service and to ensuring that people got justice. So when I realized, I mean, you realize it when English is the second language in the home, how people would trick my mother when my father, who was also like had an 8th grade education, and I would see how the system did things to him. I was like, oh, no. We're going to fix this, and I can fix this. And I understand how daunting these systems and institutions are because they want to dissuade folks from going to exercise their actual rights in them. So I just was kind of like this spitfire, like, oh, no, we're going to fix this. And as many people who are the first generation English speaking children know, you get yanked off the playground to go translate, and you usually don't even know what you're translating. But my uncle's like, I better have a driver's license when this is done. Or that's, right? Or go, no, vaya, busca el hijo de María, que él habla inglés, and so you gotta show up, and you're like, I was playing, I was on my Atari, and now you gotta figure this stuff up, and not, and sometimes the pre-internet, you didn't even have a way to figure out the words. So I think that for us, this idea that we have to serve because we went to school here and because it was required of us. I tell you, I'm on the bench sometimes and I see children, and I say children like 18-year-olds who get into trouble. And I will ask a parent, did you send them back home for the summer so that they see the value of being here? Like there are things that they're supposed to experience as first generation immigrant. And, maybe my mother used it because if you misbehave, I'm gonna send you to live with your aunt and the lights go out and I didn't want to have to do that. But this sense of service and commitment because that person who's standing next to you can't translate and can't speak. And so, but still feeling that and having to fit into this space that tells you constantly, you don't look right to be here. You don't speak right to be here. You don't eat right to be here, right? So you get a job and you bring food from home. And what it smells like. And if you're thinking, and I used to worry about that. I used to think about that. You haven't asked me the next question to get into like
Yeah.
what happened, but those are things that, you know, we consume ourselves with, unfortunately, because it's just a system that constantly tells you you are not enough, which is a lie, which is an absolute lie.
Right. Well, that's what I'm really curious about, because at a young age, you have to grow up really quickly, but you can tell that you were just like very enthusiastic and eager to drive change, right? But I
Mhm.
think often when we go into some of these spaces, seems like you're describing kind of like a deflating feeling almost, right? Like you walk in, maybe not a lot of people look like you, and then what maybe you're alluding to is like you experience some microaggressions or some uncomfortable situations. Like, tell me about when you first started working, because I'm sure when you first experienced some of these things versus later in life, you
Mhm.
even know how to deal with them differently, right? So tell me about like when you first started working, what do you remember looking around and seeing?
I'll share with this. I don't use the word microaggression because I don't think there's anything little about racism. And there's
Oh,
nothing little about how I feel when someone behaves with bias towards me or racism.
mm,
There's nothing small about it. It's this thing that you take with you. And in the middle of the humiliation, you have to make a decision, right? Because that's what
mhm,
racism is. And that's what it makes you feel. It makes you feel the sense of humiliation and you haven't done anything. And in the
mm,
midst of it, as an employer, as someone who's representing people, you have to make a decision as to how you respond so that it either doesn't hurt your client, it doesn't hurt your work, it doesn't hurt your position, right? As opposed to laying somebody out, which is not always the way to get somebody to hear you, right?
mhm.
And so that's if so I'm mad at the word microaggression because it makes something that I take home with me that causes us to have high blood pressure, that causes us to suffer from anxiety when we work in these places, because these small things, they're not small at all. They're not small at all for us. It's what you spend your time flipping around and what did I do to make it's not you. And to not have someone to say that's not you, that's their foolishness. It's not you, it's their foolishness. And how when you show up, I'll tell you my first, and I think this is maybe what you're experiencing. So lawyers tend to be terrible managers of people unless they have some leadership skills. And my second job, I worked for the first African American judge, but my second job was at this small insurance defense firm in New Jersey. And the frightening thing was that I was the first person of color to work there. Real bizarre to me.
Did they
But I
tell you
went,
that? Like, how did you
yeah,
find out?
yeah, because the employees are like, oh snap, you know, they have they're like, wow, they got a black person. So they tell you, oh my God, and you speak Spanish? Wow.
Oh my God.
And so the employees who are like the paralegals are like, this is shocking because this has never happened before. And this particular firm hired a white woman who must have never seen a black person and definitely not a black and Latina person. And she didn't know what to do with herself. So she would come into the room, and with people who have bias and who are racist, your presence makes them uncomfortable, not because there's something wrong with you, but because you are a mirror to them.
Mm.
So she'd come in the room and she'd say, oh, wow, you dress so nicely. And I would think, well, that's strange. Or we'd be having a conversation in the lunchroom and she would say, wow, you're so articulate. Now, in my mind, I'm thinking, curse word, I went to college too, right? Because why are you
I went to
surprised? I'm a
college too.
lawyer, right? I'm a lawyer, you're a lawyer. I went to college. Why are you so surprised about how I speak? But that's because her image of women who look like me
Mhm.
tells her that I'm not supposed to be this way. Ultimately, she couldn't resist and she told a joke at the office, at lunch with one of the
Mhm.
partners where she told a joke where someone else used the N-word. Now, I have to tell
Mm.
you that I knew that she thought that when she saw me, but I couldn't believe that she would tell this joke until I looked around and everyone's head was down. Now, again, all I was doing was eating my lunch, and the partner took us out and he didn't address us. I went into her office and we had a conversation, right? We had a
Wow.
conversation about, and so the problem is that people's inability and leadership to deal with these things as well. And so I constantly felt attacked when I saw her because she could not figure out how to convince me that she wasn't racist. She couldn't figure out how to convince me she wasn't because she was. But having to be subjected to her in the lunchroom, in the library, and still, like, she didn't get fired, she didn't get suspended. And what it meant to me, working in this space, meant that I was not a part of, I clearly wasn't important enough in this space that someone would do something that would cause me to feel so uncomfortable in the workspace. And not just me, the other people who felt
Yeah.
marginalized, and to not respond to it. And so those are the other things that that you're in this profession. And I'm like, wow, I'm a lawyer, you're a lawyer, I could sue this place. But then as an attorney and a young attorney, I was worried. And one of my mentors was like, oh, you don't want to get blacklisted. Now, I don't know that I would give somebody that advice right now, but it was the advice that I got at the time. And that's what I lived with. And
So did you tell anybody about that story at the time? Like, who did you?
Well, the partner was sitting at the table and he called me in and he didn't even know how to have a conversation with me about how to handle this. And I spoke to her, but what did you say to her? And, what kind of sensitivity so I ended up leaving the firm. The problem with just leaving the firm was that they then hired someone who looked like me to replace me, put her in my office, and then she experienced similar things. So I didn't we didn't improve what was happening there. But again, having to worry about performing, learning my job, trying cases, being a good attorney, and somebody else's racism, and what kind of food you eat, and and what did you do on the weekend? And having to be a part of, when your evaluation comes, how you are a part of this community that you feel excluded from. So I think when you say who you are, Quién Tú Eres, and what's authenticity, it takes time to be that person. And I don't want people who are struggling at work, still trying to figure out how to be themselves, to feel bad. It takes time. It takes time to kind of build that confidence. And sometimes it takes time to find an environment where you can do this and be like, it's okay. But it's important that you show up as you are. It is really important.
I find it so fascinating, like at so early in your career that you already knew a lot of these things, because I didn't know a lot of those things. Because I remember people used to tell me I was well spoken, and I was like, thank you. You don't, I've been working on my vocab. Oh my God, this is, you know what I mean? Like I was like, oh, this is a compliment. You know what I mean? Like it took me till later in life to understand, like, oh, you're surprised. Like, it's not like, I think in some ways it could be a compliment, but it's that surprise factor that you're talking about. It's like, oh, you didn't expect me to be able to formulate a sentence. You know what I mean? Like, you expected me to just be like, what's up, homies? Like, that's what you thought I was going to walk in the meeting with, So I think that was like it was kind of like even the pitch elevated, like, oh my God, you're so well spoken. It was just different,
Shocking, shocked. Like, you didn't go to, like, that's what I'm saying. You're in the same college class. What you're learning, I'm learning.
But I think it's fascinating too, because like, even in early in my career, if I knew that it was surprising, I don't know if I would have had the audacity to schedule a meeting and have that conversation. And I think that at an early age for you, I think speaks a lot to just like how willing you are to just have such a difficult conversation. I don't think many people would have done that.
Oh, I'm sorry, Papel. I'm sorry if I gave you the misconception that I went in and scheduled a meeting to talk to the racists at my job. I didn't do that. I went into our office because we need to have, and I closed the door.
Oh.
See, yeah. And sometimes people need that, right? So I love my forever First Lady, Michelle Obama, but I don't always take her advice about going high when people go low. Sometimes I like to meet them right where they are. Yeah, right? Because the thing is, so you are creating an environment that's gangster. Like, is that what we're doing? So then we need to have a private conversation. And I remember my mentor, I went to get language, and she said, the next time she says something racist, I want you to look at her and very calmly say, how would you feel if I told jokes and the butt of the joke always was a severely obese white woman, because that's what she was. And when my mentor told me that, I was like, wow, no curse words, but it was food for thought, right? Because what I'm saying is that you are insecure about this thing, so you're constantly deflecting. But what would happen if I did this? How would you feel? Because what I can't do is make you feel, I can't use race against you, because we don't have any power to use race against you. When colonization took away our language to even properly curse people who oppressed us. That's what colonization does. It takes away your ability to find a word to hurt your oppressor as much as they can hurt you, right? And so maybe not hurting you in that way, but really getting you to think about these kinds of things. So I think for me a lot also, I ended up having to practice how I was going to respond to the craziness that kept happening. And like I tell you, she would see me by myself and try to come convince me. Now, I mean, I've still been looking for her. I've been looking for her in a practice in New Jersey. But the reality is that I'm better equipped now. I would go home and be angry and be stressed out and come back to work and wonder what type of racial terror I was going to be subjected again by this person. And that is really what we experience, this level of people constantly trying to figure out their own stuff. And listen, stop talking to me about that. And it's okay. It's okay for your colleague to understand. Stop talking to me about that. I'm not here to educate you about this. And get back to work, because the problem is that your blessings have your name on them. What you're supposed to get in life, what you're supposed to get out of that work is for you. And people can't take it from you, but they can distract you from it. And that's what these things are. They're distractions from getting the work done. They're distractions from shining. They're distractions from you transforming systems. They're distractions. And then they begin to chip at your confidence. So,
I love that you said like chip at your confidence as well. Like I'm
yes.
curious, like you have a certain experience and then obviously you go on to do other things. How do you think that particular experience impacted the way you even wanted to show your authenticity? Maybe your next job, you're like, I'm not going to tell people what I do on the weekend or anything about my personal life until I get my first performance review. I don't know. Like, how did that impact you moving forward?
And it did, but I was fortunate enough that I went to another job where I was, again, in the minority, but the person that I worked with, the woman, was like one of my study buddies. And she was this amazing woman from the Adirondacks. And so she had not experienced race, or her understanding of race was like, these are just folks. One day she stopped me. Someone had come in. We were working in the prosecutor's office, and one of my Black friends had come in. And I had been talking to her, and I loved her. Like, we were really close. My white girlfriend, my white study partner, and my Black girlfriend came in, and I was like, girl, this, and that. And then when she left, I went back to talking to my white friend, and she looked at me and she said, why do you change how you speak when you speak to me? She said, your whole body language changes. I want to be your girl. And I hadn't realized, that I was code switching. And I loved her. I wasn't code switching because I didn't want to embrace her. It was just when I saw her, muchacha, it's me screaming at my Latina sister, and what? Get the I said, screaming. And when I thought about it, I was like, she was like, I noticed not only do you do that with her, but it's, wow, for me to really embrace you, you have to be my sister girl too. And she needed that for me to really, so it was me too. It wasn't just her in this space. It was me responding still with this piece of protection. And so I laugh. I always think about that, because then I stopped doing it. And so when I call my white girlfriends, my white sister, they're my girls, and you have to be that, and you've got to be do or die when I bring you into that space as well. But it's that thing that you're saying, like, it had to be brought to my attention as well. And so I began to feel comfortable. I'll never forget it, because she looked like she was going to cry. She said, your whole body changes.
I feel like Yeah.
right? Could you imagine that? You think about what you
Yeah,
do,
yeah,
how
yeah.
your shoulders change when you talk to your guys, when you talk to your boys,
Yeah, yeah.
and you
Well,
might have, go ahead, I'm sorry.
no, no, no. I was gonna say it's interesting. I feel like a lot, like most people, like they need to almost get like called out to realize they're code switching. Like I just had an episode
Yes.
where it was a mother and she said her kids knew what type of client she was meeting with depending on how she got dressed. So her kids are like, "Oh, you're meeting with a finance guy today, right? Oh, medical field today? Okay. Oh, tech guy? Okay."
That's
And
something.
and the son even told his mom was like, Mom, I don't like how you act when you're going to work. And then she was like,
Wow.
well, what do you mean? Well, and he was essentially saying like, if you need to change who you are to go to work, like I don't think the people at work like this other person either. And the mom,
Wow.
the kid was even saying like, should I change?
Mm-hmm.
Like, should I change who I am? And he was like, Mom, well, if you're changing to go meet up with people, like maybe I need to change who I am. It's kind of like
Wow, that's so powerful.
indirectly sending a signal that you need to change in order to be accepted within certain groups of
Mm-hmm.
people. Right. So that interesting point of like the son calling out the mom was like, oh shit, well, I need to stop. You know what I mean? And that was
Yeah.
like her moment to like stop assimilating in her own way to wherever group she was being a part of.
You know, it's interesting how my mother, again, was very, when they, my mother's primary language was Spanish when she and my father married. And I remember she said my father would leave her home and she'd answer the phone and he would come home and she was like, oh, you got a phone call. And he was like, were they white or black? And at the time, I know why he was asking. And she was like, I don't know. And he was like, well, then don't answer the phone. At the time, debt collectors were all white.
Yeah.
So if she's taking down these numbers talking about call me back, he's like, I'm not calling that back. I owe them money. And so she had to figure out, and he couldn't understand why she couldn't tell on the phone. And so she had to begin to learn these things because my father would be upset if he called back a debt collector messing around with my mother answering the phone and taking messages, right? And so I realized that at a very early age, we learn to identify these things, you know, and what it means in your family when different people are communicating and how you respond to them. And so, did I always feel comfortable? Absolutely not. I remember being a young attorney and looking young and going into depositions, and they would be waiting. I'd come in and I'm like, I'm defense counsel. We'd be waiting and waiting, and the secretary would pick up the phone and say, well, the stenographer's here, but we're waiting for defense counsel. And I'm like, didn't I just tell this chick I was defense counsel? You know, the stenographer is, I don't know where the stenographer is, but that's not me. So I decided that, well, maybe I'm not going to look so feminine. I'm not going to look so feminine. So I'm going to wear all pantsuits so people don't see me as a girl.
How were you dressed previously?
I'd wear skirt suits in my,
Mm.
you know, how I would. And then I said, I'm just going to dress in pantsuits because it's going to be more powerful and people won't see me. And then I realized how silly it was, right? Because the other part of this is that when you, not code switch, but when you hide that part of you, you're also giving up your power.
Yeah.
And there's power. I believe that we have feminine and masculine energy, everybody. And
Mm-hmm.
to suppress my feminine energy means that I can't show up in my fullness. And
Yeah.
so, when do I feel most comfortable being myself? All the time. And did it always start out that way? No. But when it really shifted was when I went to when I turned right before I turned 30. Y para ustedes que están calculando, for those of you who are calculating, that was like 3 years ago. Anyway, I
No,
was
that's
looking at myself, right? Because right before that 30th birthday, you start to try to figure out, who am I?
mhm.
And I looked at myself in the mirror, just naked, because I was like, I got to be comfortable with everything God has given me. And when I looked at my hair, I said, I'm not. I feel like I'm perpetrating a fraud. I feel like, for
Mm,
me, and not that you
mhm.
shouldn't have straight hair, but I, for me, felt like I was saying something about myself that I didn't want to say. I had hair down to my back. My mother's a Dominican beautician, so she could lay down some perm. And I was fly, all day. But I'd always wanted to get rid of my perm. And I looked in the mirror, and when I asked myself, why don't you cut your perm out? The answer was, because I'm worried about what people would say.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the answer, I can't have it. And so I grew my perm out, and not without problems in my family, not without opinions about who I was supposed to be and how, that straight hair softened my look, and how could I, all of those things. I remember, but it was when I did that, it was the most freeing thing to me in the world, because I had to be happy with me. Yeah. And I remember going to interview at the governor's office, and my mother said, and I was wearing this Afro puff, and my mother was like, so I know you're going to straighten your hair. And I was like, no, because I'm not going to lie to the governor. When I show up, I'm going to be wearing my Afro puff, so I'm not going to show up to the interview looking differently. And I put my hand on 10 Bibles and tell you, when I was sitting in the governor's office, waiting for the person to be called for the interview, I heard, Victoria, oh my God, I love your hair. Someone was screaming it from behind. No. And it was a woman I had gone to high school with, who had pulled my resume out of the pack. And I laughed, because I was like, had I not shown up authentically as who I was, I wouldn't have had, we started this interview talking about how cool it was that I was rocking this Afro puff and that my hair was great. Yeah. She didn't have any issues with that.
Everyone always talks about diversity and inclusion, right? And they're always like, well, we need more Black people in office. We need more Latinos. We need more Latinas. We need more women. And I'm just like, what's the point of bringing more people in if all they're going to see is y'all faking it? Like, the signals is, so if we go back to the data, right, 76% of Latinos suppress parts of their identities at work. If I'm a new employee and I walk into your organization, and let's say I want to rock a afro, since you're talking about hair, let's just say I want to rock braids, right? I don't see anybody. I see a lot of people in the office that look like me, but no one in the office has braids, right? The signal for me is like, oh, I got to cut my hair. I'm not allowed to wear braids here because no one else is doing it, right? But if everyone else is wearing braids, the signal is like, oh shit, I could do that here. You know what I mean? So we got to take the first step in being that representation that either we want to see in the office or that we wish we had when we were younger. I think you're in such an interesting position because you're creating representation in this like very traditional industry field, old school,
old white male.
Yeah, but not only for yourself, right? Because you talk on so many topics about even the judicial system, right? And that is, when people think of the judicial system as well, people think of like Black and Latino population, right? So you're also helping to redefine what life even like after prison looks like. Like, what are the opportunities available for this population as well? Like, when you think of representation, not only for yourself, but also this population, like what are some of the things that come to mind? Do you bear a sense of responsibility?
Absolutely. I mean, people, I practice this thing called procedural justice. Is the power, it's in my book, The Power of Dignity, and this idea of what it means to understand processes. People come into our system and they're facing consequences that might impact their money, their relationships, and their liberty, and what it means to have access to justice and understand. And so many of my colleagues in the justice system don't think that it's their responsibility to make sure that people understand, but it requires you to slow down. Sometimes it's yes, 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 and then I ask a trick question, and I'm like, you need a translator, and why that's important, and why that's allowing a person to maintain their dignity when they come to the justice system. It's why I jump on the young man who's a resident, and when he's involved in these low-level offenses that can get him deported, I start talking to him. What you gonna do when they deport you back to the Dominican Republic? Via limpia bota? You didn't even graduate from high school. That's why I'm gonna put you in this program, and you're gonna go get a high school diploma. That's why I have to be able to speak about these things. That's why it's important that people understand why I know that when the police stop young Black men, they lower their gaze oftentimes. And it's not because they're trying to be disrespectful. it's what happens is this history of what happens to people in their communities and their relationships with police. And so if I'm not talking about these things, then who is? And also pointing out spaces for my colleagues who don't believe they have implicit biases, why they have implicit biases. I mean, I tell stories about how there was an implicit bias in my courtroom for white women who were arrested outside of the downtown area, and that it was perpetuated by the police and white prosecutors.
Mi gente, what's up? It's me again. In this point of the conversation, we actually had some unfortunate technical difficulties, but Judge Pratt was able to rejoin the conversation and leave us with these closing remarks.
I do have one thing I want to end with. What inspires me to be my authentic self? Showing up that the magic comes. It's in your gifting, your mission work. When you show up as you should, as the daughter of whoever you are, I am Miss Elsie's daughter. When you show up with those lessons and all those life experiences that you have, good or bad, because God wastes nothing in your life. God does not call the qualified, he qualifies the people that he calls to do his work. That is when the magic happens. That is when the transformations happens. That's when you see a shift in the world. That's when you help people. That's when the service is done. When you show up and people can hear, wow, that was my experience too. And look at how high this person has gotten. Look at their business has been successful and they had a similar background to me. So I just want people to just keep trying to show up as authentically as possible and interrupt conversations. Let me tell you why that doesn't work. That is why it doesn't work and why you're at the table. And even if you're not at the table, I'm going to butt in at the table and tell you why you shouldn't be doing that.
I love that. Thank you so much.